Hey there, everybody. It's about bedtime yet again. Gonna keep on keeping on here. These chapters are a lot about early urban growth and suburban growth. I think we're scheduled to finish up this book next week. Might be, it's possible we won't finish it next week. It will take another week, but we'll see how it all goes. Any general questions about anything before I just dive into talking about Minnesota? All right. Actually, let me go back one slide, make sure I'm not missing anything here. A lot of the stuff in these later chapters are stuff that we've kind of talked about in previous chapters. There's kind of going through the history, just focused on the central cities a bit. So let's see. You guys might have known that well, St. Paul didn't originally have the name St. Paul. It was called Pig's Eye for a while. That didn't turn out to be the exact kind of name of a capital city that the state really wanted to keep. So switched to St. Paul, honor of who was an important figure in early Minnesota, specifically St. Paul, Father Gaultier. But this is one of the reasons why if you're in St. Paul, you might notice things named after Gaultier. Mostly there's a plaza. But for a while there was also a little bit of a battle about what city would be the capital of Minnesota. For a while, Hastings was in the running. St. Anthony, which used to be its own city, now it's part of Minneapolis. Stillwater was in the running. Stillwater, places that didn't get to be the capital got their kind of runner-up prizes. Hastings got a insane asylum. Sounds like that's not a great prize. It was seen as money invested into the area. As I mentioned, St. Anthony, a lot of the different areas that we think of as neighborhoods in Minneapolis and St. Paul were the very first suburbs. They were just very close in. And as the suburbs in general grew, and when I'm saying suburbs, picture like, uptown Minneapolis, right? You don't really think of it as not being Minneapolis, but it's definitely not downtown, right? So maybe that area you could picture being a suburb, especially when we had the early streetcars. I'll show you pictures of those and stuff. But the central cities, people who were moving out to the suburbs tended to have more money, and the cities didn't want to lose that tax base. So the cities would just expand. And actually, if you look at a map of the US and the size of different cities, some cities like New York are gigantic because they kept on just annexing their different neighborhoods. And that's New York in the US is a much older city. Twin Cities is a bit in the mid-range, but if you go to like LA itself is actually quite small because, it's suburbanized right away because it was such later development. It was after cars and stuff. So like I said, for a good while, it was kind of a contest between Minneapolis and St. Paul, which would be kind of the bigger, more powerful city. Minneapolis was an early leader because, with all those mills, and mills can be turned into other types of mills, other types of manufacturing, a whole kind of range of stuff, where St. Paul just kind of was stuck with the fur trade. And that's, of course, what put it on the map in the first place, but not exactly a growth industry of the future, right? So the different mills and whatnot, as they consolidated and expanded, they made more and more things through time, and also just the money that brought in, right? That got a big start of, maybe you don't know that we actually have a cluster of banking here in the Twin Cities. It's kind of a big local industry. And if you have a large banking industry, they're looking for places to invest their money. very, very small tangent is that banking used to be regulated so that the banks would have to lend their money within a certain geographic location of where they got their money from. Those laws were taken away through time, especially in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. That's why you saw the rise of, well, like Wells Fargo is a big bank, right? But it's like, Wells Fargo? Why is that a big bank? It's like, well, it's because we made it so that places could lend to anywhere. And honestly, the Dakotas have laws that make it so you could charge really high interest rates, and that makes the banks more money. So that's why some banks that are kind of seem to be out in the middle of nowhere have grown huge through time. All right, off that slight tangent. As I said, this chapter talks about a lot of things that have been talked about before, but in a bit more detail, specifically to the Twin Cities, because we've talked about the different settlement patterns through time quite a few times, but he talks about some specific ethnicities moving to St. Paul versus Minneapolis. And I would say that, well, if you've ever been kind of walking around downtown or near downtown, either St. Paul or Minneapolis, you might notice like there's kind of a lot of small churches that seem to not be active. You have a question?
Nope.
And the reason for that is because during the immigrant boom, every kind of little ethnicity would have its own church. They didn't really have, like mega churches or anything back then. And so that's one reason, like I said, you have all these tiny kind of little churches all over. Many of them have been switched over to new uses. And those ethnicities have often kind of moved out. And usually the suburban growth and whatever ethnicity was kind of on that side of the city, that's where they suburbanized out toward, if you can picture that, in the very early suburbs. So historically, I'm going to talk a lot about transportation in this lecture. And I've talked about transportation somewhat before. If you remember the early days, these were called the walking city because most people, they would walk, right? And in movies and stuff, everyone is on a horse, but that's because it's easier to write a story where people are on a horse and they can actually get to places fast, rather than, like it might be an hour walk to go get your groceries and get back home. So people really, really wanted to cluster very, very close. A lot of areas that are along lakes, the government would take specifically because those were considered high value areas. It would seek to kind of sometimes make a preserve. Very often, like I said, it was because these are such nice amenities. They knew that if, often bodies of water would just be drained out to put in housing and stuff, and people wouldn't really think about the environment. And that took a long time to kind of change over. Sprawl really, really took off. When we had our first streetcars. And there's a whole streetcar era in most cities in the US, including the Twin Cities, that people kind of just don't know about because it's difficult to think about taking a streetcar like all the way to White Bear Lake, right? But they used to go all the way out to the suburbs, and people would ride these streetcars kind of all over. So let's see, central city growth. I told you before that there's lots of, all the cities in the US had little kind of shanty towns. People would not have a lot of resources. They would kind of do some self-built housing. The ones that were down by the river were usually, you could kind of see that this one here is a bit flooded out. That's the risk of building on land that you don't own. And the reason they built in these dangerous areas is because it was the only place that they wouldn't be kicked off of. But this is you see this type of phenomenon still today in a number of areas of temporary shelters that are being built up. And around the world you see similar things. The main difference for Minnesota is, they each have a little chimney because we would freeze otherwise. So Minneapolis, 1862. This is 1901, I believe, and this is Washington Avenue in downtown Minneapolis. I don't know if y'all know the city that well or not, but this is where there's light rail right now. But it used to be a massive amount of train cars in this whole area here. The reason it's called the warehouse district is because you would have trains come in, and you would have storage of all kinds of stuff for a number of reasons. Partially because you have the power here and manufacturing, but also downtown Minneapolis became kind of like the first big shopping area in the Twin Cities. It's where everyone did their shopping, and so you'd have to have storehouses of stuff. These days we have what's called often just-in-time delivery, which is places don't store stuff in huge amounts. They don't, until something is kind of needed, it's not manufactured and then moved to a place. So you save a lot of money by not having to store a bunch of stuff. So a lot of these are changed into condos. Well, recently changed into condos. For many years, a lot of these, they try to make them into commercial space, but a lot of them would stay vacant because there just wasn't that much of a need for commercial space, especially in older buildings when we had these big new shiny buildings that we're putting in. I don't need to write this stuff. St. Anthony Falls. This rail line here is one of the first rail lines that was taking commuters regularly back to their home. This one here goes to the area over by the U of M in Dinkytown, which obviously is part of Minneapolis today, but it was a suburb at the time that people would commute out to. So what came before all that? The kind of largest, closest thing to mass transit within the city was the omnibus, which is just, like it kind of looks like. It looks similar to like a stagecoach. But these, again, were usually if you had a bit more money. Most people would do a lot of walking. This is actually a postcard from Minneapolis, 1910. One of the things that we forget about history of the local area is actually the air quality used to be terrible. And if you're ever downtown, you could still see, the video we saw the other day talked about how the markings on the one building are left over from the coal and whatnot. Plenty of the buildings, you could still see that. At the time, like I said, they put that on a postcard. The reason this is colored in, they hand colored these because it wasn't easy to do, but for a postcard they'd be colored in. But seeing the smokestacks was a bit of a mark of prosperity. People weren't thinking that much about how polluting it was. So the suburbs, and what the suburbs eventually became, things like having a yard, your own home, trees, grass, stuff like that. A lot of those norms happened during an age when kind of country clubs were really big, and country clubs still exist, but they were kind of a place for the wealthier people to go out to, and that's where, like I said, a lot of the norms of what suburban living would be like kind of became established. People would have events and picnics and things. Town and Country Club, I think, still exists in St. Paul. The other thing about these is they tended to be very economically and racially exclusive. Very often even religiously exclusive. So if you weren't WASP, if you've heard that term?
White Anglo-Saxon Protestant?
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. It's a term that people usually don't know these days, but they used to kind of mean everything. Yeah, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. You had to be all of those things to be in the upper crust and allowed into the exclusive clubs.
Looks like a whale at the time.
Yeah, very, very stripey, I guess, was in the fad in the 1917. Let's
That
see.
looks like it would be the insane asylum.
Oh, I suppose. Pretty funny. Another country club picture. Like I said, even though obviously this is not a house, the general look and layout is kind of what became the norm for suburbanization. And you can also see here, even though this is 1910, the wealthy were starting to get cars more and more. This is just another picture of, like I said, it's interesting. You'd have people commuting to their job, and this is the same railroad, and they'd be underneath would be the different shanty towns and things that people would drive over. And sites like that were part of the thing that were driving people to move further and further out. That and the news stories, there's actually been lots of great books written about this. The news stories at the time were very salacious, meaning they would talk about the city. Look, I got a picture of the city, not really. But they would talk about the dangers of living in the city, right? And how downtown Minneapolis is, all these immigrants from different places, and you might be robbed and all this type of thing. The news really played it up because it sells papers. Past times are similar to these times, right? All right, so through time, like I said, the switch over into trolleys, into cable cars. Well, the very first ones, and as you can see, this could fit like kind of a lot of people compared to something like a stagecoach. Also, the ride compared to a stagecoach, way smoother along tracks, way smoother. These days, it feels like it's very squeaky, makes noise, and it feels kind of bumpy. But a lot of problems if they're pulled by horses, as they all were at first. Horses are like living animals, right? And so they defecate, they die, they get sick, like all kinds of things happen. Very often, honestly, if a horse would die that was a work animal, they would shove it to the side of the road and just leave it to rot. There wasn't a real large garbage pickup service. So if you can imagine sites like that around your city and whatnot, really encourage the changeover of these. See a little advertisement here showing that this vehicle, and it's 200 horsepower, right? It's like, well, we get rid of these guys. If you remember when we talked about farming and whatnot, and the switch off to oats being less in demand and whatnot, this was a big part of that. Less use of horses as these labor animals. So the first ones were electric, and this is out in Stillwater. Like I said, these went out to the suburbs, and these were all over. It was a big part of the early growth of the life of the Twin Cities.
You think that building's still up there? I swear
Yeah.
I've seen that building.
That's the one on the crest, right? By where the armory used to be?
Could be. Oh, actually, it's kind of funny. I was out to Stillwater just the other day. They had a fall harvest fest thing. And they have trolleys that are on tires now, but you could still go on these old trolleys. It's kind of interesting. Good eye. You can identify that building.
I used to live in Stillwater, so not downtown, but
I actually spent a huge amount of time there because my friend's car broke down, and then we just ended up hanging out there. Well, anyway. So the vehicles through time, these trolleys got larger and larger, right? So they could be more economical. You could transport more and more people. This is downtown Minneapolis, 1896. Don't know if you could see the rail lines, but places would really battle to try to locate on where the trolley lines crossed. Similar to when you talked about the old rail lines in small towns, and if you could get a place where they crossed, that's a place where it makes sense to have a stop. Similar rationality. As you can see, they're getting larger and larger here. And it's similar to the rail lines, when I talked about how they made money, it was usually involving the real estate on areas that tracks would be laid out on, and that kept the actual prices low for a good while. And people developed a norm of just kind of like hopping on these and kind of getting to know their city and their area in ways that they really hadn't before. Like when I talked about how each little neighborhood had its little church and everything, the city was made up of a whole bunch of different little tiny communities that really did not intermingle much. But once people could just like pay a fraction, pay a nickel or something, and kind of you could ride all day, and really kind of get to know your neighbors, get to know your place. City grew through time. That's the building of the Fauché Tower there. Fauché Tower was finished 1929. Timing was the same as when the stock market fell, and right before the stock market crash, before most stock market crashes, people are kind of investing large sums of money and getting kind of a little risky with their money. As you can see, Fauché Tower at the time was far larger than any other buildings around it. I don't remember if I've mentioned this before, but the city made them build this little apron area around it because they thought eventually this would just fall because it was too tall. It was too tall structurally. They felt it would fall, and so if it was built right on the corner and it fell, it could like damage these other buildings. But here it would just maybe damage its own. It's still up today, obviously, though, right? Although there's towering buildings all around it, so people hardly can see the Fauché. But if you get a chance, if you're downtown, great restaurants and whatnot, and they have great places to eat and sitting in Fauché. All right, I talked about how downtown became the main place where people were shopping, right? This is far before suburbs had malls. Like I said, suburbs were just bedroom suburbs at the time. People would just go there to go to sleep. Often there weren't even schools yet in suburbs, or very basic things. We jump a little bit to 1923. You can see the automobile kind of taking over a bit, right? There are still streetcars here at this time, but you can see there's a lot of congestion, right? A lot of congestion. It's kind of tough to imagine downtown being this busy these days, especially still so much kind of in pandemic mode. This was also a reason why people were moving more and more out into the suburbs. But like I said, even people who lived in the suburbs, if they wanted to shop, they'd come downtown. You can see some of the rail cars still there.
This is Minneapolis or St. Paul?
This is Minneapolis. Yeah, this is Nicollet Avenue, Minneapolis. Hennepin Avenue. I think like the 90s is over here now, if you know that kind of area a bit. Nicollet Avenue. Currently, it's a big shopping area. Nicollet Avenue, they've tried a number of times to make it pedestrian only to try to encourage people to like walk and shop. But it's not pedestrian only yet. I think it might be buses only. This here is actually the old signals for street lights. You used to have a manual person up there who would operate them. I've traveled lots of places in the world that they still have that. They still have a manual person who's gonna change over the lights. Kind of tough to imagine.
Dreadful job.
Yeah.
Because you can't zone out.
Oh yes. Yeah. So let's see, one of the other things that really increased people moving out to the suburbs was balloon frame houses, which are relatively easy to put up. not that similar to what houses are like these days. Self-built. People would actually, in magazines, you could go to the back, and often there'd be like examples of frames for building your own house. And if you did a mail order to the company, they'd send you for their plans. People would do that and just buy their own plans and put up their own houses and hope for the best. I don't need to go through all this stuff. I talked about how they annexed places already. I don't need to go through all of that.
It's a buggy.
Well, Model T Ford. I don't know if people know in general how much automobiles changed the U.S. in so many ways. Henry Ford here. So Henry Ford and his idea for the assembly line. He got the idea while working in the meat industry. I don't know if anyone has ever worked in the meat industry, but you know, like you have your cow carcass, right? Put it on a hook, and they roll it down, and you'll have like someone who's a specialist on some cut of meat, and they'll cut off that part, and then they have that part, and they're putting that part in packages, and then they roll the thing down, and you have someone who's a specialist in a different cut of meat, right? And they cut through it until it's just like all done. Well, he thought to himself, well, why don't we just reverse that process and we could make cars? So cars before that, like you'd have a team of people who would make a whole car together, right? The assembly line process is much more efficient. It's much more of an alienating way to work, meaning, well, so your car, you're gonna have just kind of like the frame, right? And you put it down, and you have someone who's a specialist on steering wheels, right? So they're gonna put a steering wheel in, and you move it down, and someone puts on tires. But you typically have one person then who's doing repetitive motion, one little thing over and over, right? It's more efficient, but it's also work that a lot of people didn't want to have. A lot of people didn't want to do that work. So what that means is Henry Ford, he had to increase wages. He increased wages quite a bit. Now, what he said his philosophy was, and if you ever heard of the term Fordism or Fordist, maybe, but what that means is he said he felt that his workers should make enough money that they could buy a car, right? If they're making cars, they should be able to buy a car. Seemed reasonable enough, but also in actuality, he just needed to pay people more. Because people didn't want to do it. It was real tough work. And so he did increase the salaries, and so what that meant was other places had to kind of keep up with those salaries as well. So we had a hugely growing middle class who could consume stuff. And so what that does is that tends to be very good for your economy if you have a large middle class where everyone is making things and everyone is buying things, right? Because if you're making things, you need someone to buy those things to make more things, right? Well, if people don't have the money to buy those things, well then you're not going to be paid to make those things, right? It's all connected. I don't need to go through all this stuff. So through time, the old trolleys started to change up. They started switching to rubber tires. They started to going off the track, would call themselves trackless trolleys. As you can still see here though, electrified still. See them getting kind of bigger here. Competing for space for the roads. Increasingly these started to kind of basically look like buses, right? The trackless trolleys. 1946. So the automobile companies mixed with rubber companies, oil companies, Well, they were found guilty of a criminal conspiracy because they did buy out the trolley system in most urban areas and either dismantled them or often sold them to Mexico. Some of them are still running in Mexico. Well, like I said, they were found guilty. Their fine was $5,000, which was inconsequential amount of money for these companies to pay for the amount of money that they made switching everyone over to vehicles, right? And that is also when the suburbanization really started to push out. Actually, hold on a sec. Let me back up. I think I actually missed. I think I started too far forward because I think I did not talk about this chapter. Oh, I didn't talk about this chapter. All right, let me talk about this chapter a little bit. Chapter 13, which I just skipped over. Well, 13, as you know from looking at it, is mostly a bunch of maps and about 1 page of text. So I'm going to show you the maps, and we'll talk about them. Let me explain. This is the first map in the book. And, you know, if you're confused about urbanized area and what that means, typically places that are within what's called the MUSA, municipal sanitations, sour and septic systems, right? MUSA. I'll look up the term later. What this means, though, is if you want a place to be developed, right, as a suburb, you have to put in your municipal services of, you know, when your toilet flushes, that it goes somewhere, that you have water that comes into your place. Roads, right? Electrical grid, a lot of things that we often don't think about, but cost a lot of money. Well, that's what these are about, right? So you could definitely have people living here, obviously, but they kind of don't have those costs subsidized as much, in a nutshell. All right, so some maps from this chapter. Population distribution in the year 2000. You know, you can see in general people are clustered in the Twin Cities in general. Number of clusters in some different areas. Population density in the year 2000 and population change 1990 to 2000. If you remember when I was talking about not just suburban growth, but kind of the exurbs a bit, right? The suburbs that are a bit further out than regular suburbs, that's kind of what you're seeing here. Median age and population. Well, in general, the younger populations are moving away from rural areas, right? The same story we've talked about a lot, just shown in maps. So you have, in general, in the outlying areas, you have what are called passive income earners, right? People who are on Social Security, aren't making a lot of money, maybe they're on some type of retirement. So often, although they buy things and whatnot, there's not a lot of kind of economic vitality happening in these areas. Let's see. One of the other measures of kind of economic vitality is where college grads live, right? And again, if you look at these, it's like, well, we have central cities, some other areas to some extent.
What's happening up right at that very north point over there?
Where's Duluth over here?
Duluth is right at that, can I come up and?
Yeah, come
point
on
to
up.
it? I believe Duluth is right here.
Yeah.
Duluth's right there.
Oh, so
Grand
this
Portage
whole
is
area
That's great, like Grand Marais over there.
must include.
Thunder Bay and stuff.
Oh yeah, that
Grand
could be.
Portage.
Yeah, which I think our last chapter talks about how like that area is moving toward tourism and whatnot. So that might be what's going on up there. Incomes, right? Higher median incomes versus Social Security incomes, right? These are kind of like, you know, opposite images of each other. Similar measures, families in poverty, median value of owner-occupied housing, right? How much is your home worth? Kind of similar stories. older housing stock versus newer housing stock. You'll notice, again, that this is the central cities are kind of left out of this equation of newer housing stock, and this is a suburban and exurban kind of a thing. All right. Well, as always, I do like y'all to work on some questions, so I'm going to come out with some cards. Oh, actually, stop this thing.